He also liked the work of people like Jan Scheichelt, and thought that he was unique and exceptional as an artist too. So when he was producing pieces, promotional materials, and so on, he liked to incorporate this kind of mix and match of things that were old, mixing them together with things that were modern. So, in a lot of the stuff that we can look at with Lester Beale, we can see that Jan Scheichelt's Bauhaus kind of aesthetic being incorporated into the things that he's doing, but he's also incorporating things like, this letter form that's definitely a display type, or using these glyphs of the hands pointing that are left over from Victorian style posters, or even wood type images like that one that are incorporated. So he did these kind of hodgepodge configurations in the work that he was doing that were very unique and exceptional in his time. And here's another example where he's using old style wood type letter forms that are integrated together, but doing them in a way that was very much like the stuff that Jan Scheichelt was doing. To talk about Lester Beale, though, and to really look at and examine the full of his work, we have to understand what started to happen in the 1930s. And there was a really big event that happened. This is before World War II came along. A really big event that came along that changed the world. Can anybody think of the event that I'm thinking about from the 1930s?
Great Depression.
The Great Depression was the event. What is a depression?
From an economic standpoint?
From an economic standpoint, not an emotional standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, what is a depression? And why was this one the Great Depression?
Do you want a summary, or do you want like the whole?
Summary.
The bottom falls out of the market.
Out of the stock market, and then what happens? And then what happens? When the bottom falls out of the market, what happens?
You never just loses money, or goes broke, bankrupt, whatever,
Yeah.
Name your economic despair.
Let's do a little example in this room of what happens when a depression comes along. So if we have a depression, that means that the economy, everybody that uses their money to buy things from other people, they lose that. What happened with the Depression was the stock market fell. A lot of people were invested in the stock market, and those people that had money in the stock market suddenly found that all of the stuff that they had invested there was worthless, that they thought that they were rich. And some people weren't even rich. People were playing the stock market willy-nilly. It didn't really matter whether or not they were rich or not, but there were a lot of people that had money tied up in the stock market, and then they realized that the stock market was based upon false promises. It was like kited money, or it was like shadows. It didn't really exist. The things that they were investing in were not there. And so once they realized that that they actually had no holdings, they were suddenly poor. There were a lot of people that did runs on the bank, and so the banks were bombarded with people trying to withdraw all their cash, so the banks had no money to dish out, and there were a lot of regulations that we have in place now that didn't exist at that time, caused a lot of people a lot of financial strife. So let's just say that crash happens and that people have all gone to their own corners. Some of them are holding on to all of their money, sticking it underneath their mattresses. Other people are suddenly realize that they have no money in the bank at all, and they have nowhere to go. That means that if Liz runs a shop, and she has 5 people that work for her. Well, let's say 2 people. We're going to make it Treat and Branton, who are employees of Liz. And Liz was one of these people that invested in the stock market. Sorry, Liz, but you lost. You have no money now. And so Liz has no money, which means that she in turn can't pay Treat or Brandon. So Brandon and Treat now are jobless as well. So we've got 3 people here that are jobless. These guys all bought their groceries from Jan. Jan runs a grocery store. But now Jan is no longer looking at these guys to bring in her cash flow because they no longer have money, so they can't buy from her. In fact, they keep on coming to Jan and saying things like, "Can you extend me some credit? Can you go ahead and just give me the end pieces on the bread that nobody wants, or like the leftover pieces of meat that get thrown out, and we'll take those." These guys are all like really scrounging for money. But Yun isn't the only one that's facing this. There are other people in other parts of the room, like say Christopher and Anisha back there. They've just lost their jobs too, and they're coming to Yun and saying the same thing. Yun's got to put her foot down and say, no, I can't do that. I can't extend credit. So Yun no longer is able to afford credit to these guys. And as a result, the amount of people that she would end up buying the stuff to stock her grocery store, they're not buying the stuff that she has on her shelf. So she's no longer buying things from people like Adam. Adam sells canned fruit. You sell canned fruit, and Mark sells, I don't know, paper towels. And the people that would buy those things from Yun, they're no longer there. So Yun has cut down on the amount of paper towels and canned fruit that she's buying from you guys. You guys, in turn, are now laying off people because you no longer have people like Yun who run grocery stores that are buying from you. So you're cutting down your workforce. And that means that Kelly and Pete and Mark Leo all lose their jobs or are cut back on the amount of hours that they have. Do you see how this works? Everybody is hurting because Liz invested in the stock market. But you weren't alone. A lot of other people were doing it too. So how do we solve this problem? What do we do? Everybody's lost their jobs.
New Deal.
The New Deal, yeah. The New Deal. So what was the New Deal, Adam?
I think it's a public works project. Basically, the government wanted to bail on everybody. Kind of like I'm not sure how old you guys are, but about 10 years ago, basically the government said there's a company called AIG, which the government deemed too big to fail.
Mm-hmm.
So basically said the country's too big to fail. And when they start all these like massive public works projects, like the Hoover Dam, highway system. Highways weren't quite there yet, and basically it was an attempt by the government to put everybody back to work, but cash in people's pockets. And then they got World War II, and they put people in factories, and they all had jobs and so forth and so on.
So the New Deal was Roosevelt's new plan to try to get people back to the workforce. And what they did was they hired people like Treat and Brandon and Liz, and they said, okay, we're going to give you jobs like we're going to build a new park system. So you get to build roads, and you're going to be working on Mount Rushmore, and you're over here, you're going to work on building Hoover Dam. Now you've got money in your pocket. So now you've got money in your pocket. Now you can go back to Yun and you can say, hey, we've got money in our pockets. Can I buy paper towels and canned goods and whatever else that I possibly need because now I've got money in my pockets. So then in turn, now you, as Yun can do, she can turn to Adam, she can turn to Mark and say, hey, I need to buy more of those supplies that I had cut back on. And so now Adam and Mark are saying, oh, okay, now we need more of this stuff. So they start to hire other people to start to resupply the things that there's a demand for. And so by creating these jobs, that the government had created these jobs that were public projects, it put people back into the workforce and gave them an opportunity to re-energize the economy. Once those jobs started to come along, then other jobs started to come along and people started to develop new work. What this all leads to is the folks that were hit hardest in this period of time, this Great Depression, were the ones that were considered the extraneous, the not really necessary people in the system at that time. And if you are running a business and you're finding that the number of people that are buying things from you are dwindling and you still want to keep everything going, I still want to be able to buy fruit and paper towels, but I have to cut back someplace. The place I might cut back on is my advertising, because I'm losing customers anyhow, and my advertising, no matter what I do with my advertising, is not going to give people their jobs so that they can have money. So the people that I'm laying off are the people that are part of the arts community. So the artists, the photographers, designers, painters, anybody that had something to do with work in the arts, they found that they were one of the first ones that were eliminated in this job loss. And so the government set up not only public works projects for people that could physically build things, but they also built public works projects for people that were in the arts. Lester Beale was one of the folks that got a job, and there were a number of them that got jobs through the public works. Works projects. They called them the WPA, or Works Progress Administration was the name of the overarching organization that was part of the government project, this public works project. And then for Lester Beale, he worked within a specific segment of that WPA. For him, he worked on something called the Rural Electrification Administration. Now, there were a lot of these kinds of bureaus that were set up with public work projects. The goal of the Rural Electrification Administration was to bring electricity to those parts of the country that did not have electricity. And it's hard for us to imagine now because we think about electricity and everybody's got electricity, right? Well, they didn't in the 1930s. There were big swaths of the country that did not have electricity, specifically those in the Midwest and the Far West. So Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas, Kansas, Indiana, even Ohio. There were places that were in the general Midwest portions of the country that did not have electricity at this time. And it wasn't because these folks didn't want electricity, it was that they had just learned how to work without it. They didn't have really a need for it. They went to bed when it was night and they got up with the cows, and they didn't really have a need for an alarm clock, and so they didn't have a lot of need for staying up late at night and reading, or watching TV, because there was no TV. And so their lifestyles didn't really require that they have electricity. So what the problem here that people like Lester Beale and others were facing was that they had a group of people that just didn't really see a reason for the government to step in and give them electricity, even though the government was saying it's free, we want to do this. These people actually had kind of a distrust of the government at this time. I mean, as far as they were concerned, the government was responsible for the Great Depression. It was bad economic decisions on the part of Washington and the Hoover administration that really caused the Depression to happen. And so there was a lot of distrust by these folks for letting government to step onto their property for any reason whatsoever. They were the third, fourth, fifth generation pioneers, really. I mean, if you think about who their ancestors were, these were the folks that had decided way back when that they didn't like city life and that they wanted to go out and be independent and run their own lives. So they were used to running farms and raising crops and doing things that they needed to survive, and not really worry so much about the national economy. To them, the electricity wasn't really that big of a deal. So Lester Beale's job was to convince them, give them reasons why electricity would be a good thing for them. And in doing so, once they had been convinced, once they decided, yeah, okay, I'll go ahead and let the government step into my property, then people like Treat and Brandon and Liz could actually do their jobs and start to erect telephone poles and put in city water systems and all kinds of telephone towers and all kinds of stuff to get these guys technologically up to speed. The other thing that Lester Beale was facing was not only that he had to convince people, but he had to do so in a means that was minimal, meaning that a lot of these folks didn't speak and didn't write, couldn't read. They couldn't read or write. They were illiterate. And it was, again, because they had grown up in a time and a place, a location where they didn't need to read and write. I mean, how often did they need to have written conversations with cows? Not very often. So it really wasn't that important to them that they had book learning, and instead they were able to survive without. So Lester Beale and the imagery that he created for these posters, he was trying to make a very forceful case for this program of bringing electricity into these people's homes, while at the same time doing it with very minimal amounts of words. And so he relied upon graphics. You might notice here that the color palette that he's chosen is very patriotic, red, white, and blue. And whenever there is a word that's being utilized, it's a pretty simple one. And so maybe they have one word that somebody could ask, hey, how do you spell that word, R-A-D-I-O, or what's that word right there? And then somebody would say radio, and they go, oh yeah, I heard about radio. That would be kind of cool to have that come into my house. I can see that that's what they're trying to say, radio coming into my house. And so they could get it. And then also, as we got closer to the war, the idea of using electricity for the sake of defense became very much a rallying cause for a lot of people. And so maybe for them it wasn't so much about trusting the government about coming in, putting electricity in their homes, but understanding that the enemy could now potentially fly over their farmlands and bomb the holy heck out of where they lived. That touched people's lives. And so they didn't want that to happen, and so the idea of doing something that was for the sake of defense, again, demonstrated through pictures more so than words, was very empowering and definitely persuasive for these folks. And so Lester Beale again and again and again used imagery that was really a storytelling in the way that he did it, and he simplified his work in a lot of different ways in order to get the message across without having a lot of pictures in place. Very European kind of attitude that he's pulling in. So he was one of those folks that was part of the Rural Electrification Administration. There were other projects that went on. I don't have examples here, but you can look at some of the travel posters that were done at that time, especially for the National Park System. The government was really promoting the idea of building a national park system. So all of our national parks, Yosemite and Grand Canyon and Mount Rainier and the Metro Park System here in Ohio, and Cuyahoga Valley Park System, all part of the National Park System, and became very, very popular, very possible thanks to the WPA program. Other things that we saw as part of the WPA, there were a lot of buildings that came up in Cleveland, like the Detroit Superior Bridge in Cleveland. That you might know, that span that crosses over from downtown Cleveland into the West Side Market. That bridge with the characters holding up the wagons, that is a WPA project. The building of the Terminal Tower downtown Cleveland, that was a WPA project. And there were a number of other projects that were along the same lines that were WPA projects that all came about as a result of trying to get people back to work. So WPA was a godsend to a lot of people. And it did do the job of pulling the country out of this economic plight. The problem was that in selling this, Roosevelt had to agree that the WPA projects would have a span of 5 years. So anybody that had a job with the WPA, they could only hold that job for 5 years, and then after that they were expected to go out and find a job on their own, which I understand, welfare and all of that stuff. But the problem was that when that cutoff came, it was a sudden cutoff because so many people had signed up all at once, and it hadn't been staggered out, that those jobs were suddenly lost again, and people were right back where they started. So the Depression, and why we call it the Great Depression, had 2 cycles. It had the first cycle that happened in around 1930, 1931, and then it picked up again around 1936, 1937. And so it went through 2 cycles. And it wasn't until we got to World War II that we saw that the second cycle come out, because that's where the new jobs were at. It wasn't in the WPA anymore, now it was in the war. But in any case, economics, they're always so touchy. Another person that we want to talk about is a guy named Alvin Lustig, and I showed this slide because it shows actually a bulk of some of the pieces that he did. He was involved in book publishing. And so among American designers, he was unique in his own special way for doing what we call recovers. Books. Most of the books that he did were already books that had long been published, that had existed in the publishing world for years before. But his job was to create these new covers to make the book look fresh, make the book look new. And if we were to look back on what was happening in book publishing in the 1940s, 1950s, we would see that they really looked like Pulp Fiction kind of novels, really tacky Harlequin romance kind of covers that were going on at that time. And Alvin Lustig had a very fresh take in the way that he did his designs. He was not only a designer of books and book jackets, but he also did magazines, interior design, and textiles. Just to go back a little bit in understanding who he was, he actually was a very failed student. He was horrible at school. He grew up in Montana. I think it was Montana, Colorado. Hang on, let me look again and see what my notes say here. Sorry, not Denver, Colorado. Sorry, he was from Denver, Colorado, and he hated school. Absolutely hated school. He was a bad student. He didn't like coming to classes. But he did like doing magic. So he spent a lot of time, performing card tricks and doing magic tricks for his friends and all of that stuff. And actually, the only way that his teachers could get him to come to school was to promise that he could do a performance for his class, on a regular basis, once a week. Show up for class 5 days out of the week. On the 5th day, we'll let you do a little magic performance for the class, and that was his reward. So that's how they got him to come to school. And unfortunately for him, he had a teacher that had recognized that he had a keen interest in art, that he was not only just really good at his magic tricks, but that he actually had some artistic talent. But unfortunately, he was living in a part of the country where there was no art at all, that his family was just the opposite of being artistic in any way, shape, or form. He was the oddball in the family. But this teacher encouraged him to study art, to learn about art, and to actually use that art as a way of creating posters for his magic shows. So he would, again, to keep him entertained and keep him engaged enough in school, this is what she ended up doing, was teaching him how to do typography and do designs and so on. And so he started to use that as a skill and got better and better and better at it. So by the time he was in his late teens, he ended up getting a job working at a print shop at the back of a drugstore and started printing things on a regular basis and learned the ins and outs of the real printing world. And then from there, he continued to build up clients and build up projects to the point where he became very well known for his book cover designs, and just his designs in general. Now, as far as the style that he utilized, he was playing with those same effects that Paul Rand came across. And we looked at the one cover that Paul Rand did the other day with H.L. Mencken on the cover. Alvin Lustig came across the same situation where he knew that typesetting was very, very expensive, that was taking a lot of time, and that if he could pare down what the stories were in these novels that he was doing recovers on, and do the typography himself, he could save a lot of money on these projects, and that saved everybody a lot of time and money, and then he could just continue to do some really fresh and unique stuff. And so that's what he did. His book covers were always kind of a synthesis of what was happening within the novel or within the book that he was recovering. And time and time again, he used hand lettering for the things that he was doing. He felt that it was really important always to be able to read the material that was within the book itself. So unless you read the book, you couldn't really understand how to reinterpret what was happening in the book. And so that was part of what he was doing also when he was designing these covers. He didn't believe it was necessary really to design down. He said that in order to achieve better sales, that the summarization was the better way to go. So instead of having one generalized image like you would on Pulp Fiction or a Harlequin romance kind of novels, if you've ever seen one of those, that has some kind of romanticized image, he felt that doing these things that were actually a little bit more abstract could tell a story in a much more engaging way that made people actually examine the cover as they were reading through it and seeing how the elements that were on the cover related to what was happening on the inside of the book. And so he had a very interesting perspective. And the other part about him was that he was continually trying to re-educate himself. So once he learned about art and he got very engaged in it and in the design world itself, he found his passion. And he decided that he wasn't done with educating himself from that point forward. And so he actually went and studied with the famed architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and did work with him at one of his teaching institutes. So he worked with him at Taliesin East for a while, and studied there for a while, and then he used what he has learned through Frank Lloyd Wright to incorporate into some of the graphics for books that he did from that point forward, and that launched him into a new realm of kind of design that he could do. It brought his work into the attention of companies like Knoll Corporation, so he started to do promotions and advertisements for Knoll Corporation. And then after that, because of his relationship with Knoll, which was a furniture company, they started to ask him to design textiles and to design furniture for them, and so that's what he ended up doing there too. And he was very, very interested in this idea of the contrast between scale. So he was playing with these big, massive, amorphic kind of shapes that he was introducing with these hard geometric forms. And this, again, we can see elements of this European style kind of integrating through these hard lines, but the amorphic forms are really more along the lines of American humor, if you will. And the softer elements that we were seeing and those cut-out elements that we were seeing in the stuff of Paul Rand. So the stuff that Alvin Lustig was doing was kind of this montage between these hard geometrics and the soft organic forms. Certainly also has something to do with the setting off of the atomic bomb and all of that stuff that was happening at that time because of the melting forms and just this whole aspect of kind of scientific elements that are incorporated in the things that are done here, and you can almost see like amoeba-like shapes or amoeba-like kind of thinking or scientific kind of thinking at work in the designs that are working here. Unfortunately for us, Alvin Lustig died at a very early age. He was only 40 years old when he died. So he did not have a long life. The last 2 years of his life, I'll just say he died from diabetes. So, and unfortunately, that robbed him of his eyesight 2 years before he died. So when he was doing projects like this, he was actually blind when he was doing these projects. Fortunately, he was so well known and loved at that point that he had a full staff of people that he could explain what it was that he wanted to them, and then they could visualize through and create things through his explanation of what he was doing. He had served as a consultant at Yale. He served as a teacher at Black Mountain College, which became Art Center School in Los Angeles, and so he had a very prolific career. For this person that started out with absolutely no interest in school, he became one of the country's better teachers. So, Alvin Lustig. Another designer that's really important in this time, and another self-taught designer, is a guy named Bradbury Thompson. Bradbury Thompson did not start out in art at all. He was actually a print rep, and that was where he got his background. So he was out there selling printing to people, and he worked for a company called Westvaco, and was out there talking about new innovations in printing. And one of the big innovations that had happened at this time was they had started to move away from using red, yellow, and blue as colors in printing, which you can see at the top one, red, yellow, and blue that were used up there, and transition them into cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So cyan, magenta, yellow, and black were the colors that started to transition across in the printing world. So anybody that was involved in this, they needed to basically be re-educated a little bit about how these colors worked and how you could get a better spectrum of colors as a result of using these four colors to mix rather than the red, yellow, and blue plus black that had been the previous version. And so when he was explaining things to these designers, he was finding that he could say it as much as he wanted to, but he really needed to show them. He needed to demonstrate for them. And there was nobody else at the company that really, at Westvaco, that was doing this. And so he said, well, you know what, how about I do some promo pieces for Westvaco, for our company, to demonstrate what I'm talking about when I'm trying to explain to these designers how to break colors out and to get across the idea of this four-color separation. And he said, sure, go ahead. Well, they gave him as much printing as he wanted, and Westvaco also sold paper, so they gave him as much paper as he wanted. Paper and printing free, all you want. Artwork, there was no artwork. There was no artwork to be had, and so Bradbury Thompson had to get inventive with this, and so he said, well, what if I use stuff that's in the back rooms, old artwork that's left over from other projects that it hasn't been, that the designers who worked on it, they see no use for it anymore, so it's just filling up, flat files for us left and right. How about if I use that to create these pieces? And they said, sure, go ahead. So that's what he did. He started to put together these promotional pieces for Westvaco using things that he found on hand. So he found, art museum catalogs that showed African masks, and then he incorporated that or tied that together with typography, which again he could get for free because they had that capability at the printing plant that he was at. So he'd use typography and put it together with these African masks, and he would create this kind of composition using just those elements that he could find. And he would do this again and again and again through all of the things that he did. So he found all kinds of odds and ends images in the back rooms of Westvaco, and he used them again and again and again to create these promo pieces that he would then use to explain the printing process and how it all worked. And if he couldn't find anything, then he would just start cutting apart pieces of stats and films, and blowing them up and making them super large. And so you'd have halftone images that he could cross over the spreads and do interesting things with them in that regard. But even more so than just where he found his images was how he started to incorporate the images. So he played with the idea of not only just woodcut images or old mechanicals or medical documents and the stuff that he was using, but he was also thinking about the paper and how the paper went together. So knowing that he had plenty of paper, and paper that could be coated paper or uncoated paper. What's the difference between coated paper and uncoated paper?
Like a matte or a gloss, or I don't know what they used back then.
Yeah, no, it's the same thing. So a coated paper is a paper that's got kind of a shiny surface to it, and an uncoated paper or matte paper is a paper that's flat and that the ink can saturate into. And what he was trying to explain to these designers is when you printed on one kind of paper versus another, you'd get different kinds of ways that the ink would hold up. So if you've ever noticed, when you print on something that's on a glossy paper, the colors seem way brighter than if you print on something that's on a matte stock or an uncoated stock, that the ink tends to saturate in. And the designers that were working in this time, they needed to understand that. Plus, he also needed to explain to them that you could mix and match your press forms. So when you put together your printed pieces, they put them together in something called signatures. And a signature means that page, if you open up a magazine or something, you might find that at the center it's stapled together at the center. And if you start to unstaple and take that magazine apart, you're going to find that there's crossovers from one story that don't necessarily come up to another story. So those pieces, when they put them together on a press form, they put them together in something called signatures. So when they are all done, they'll fold those signatures down and stack them into each other and staple them and cut off the excess edges, and everything fits together like it does in a regular book. But when you're putting it together mechanically for printing, you might have different kinds of signatures. And if you, as a designer, decide to play with those signatures, you can do some really interesting things. So you could have one signature, one section of your book, or certain pages in your book that are printing on really super shiny paper, and other parts that are printing on an uncoated paper or even a colored stock. So you can mix and match that way. You can also mix and match through the way that you do your inks. So because he had all of these presses available and different kinds of printing equipment available, he could print some pages so that he was printing four-color printing on one half of the spread when it all came together in the signature. So one signature was printing on four-color presses, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and another signature that was the other side of that spread, because they're stapled together, would print just black ink on white paper. And so by mixing and matching the textures, mixing and matching the kinds of printing that he could do some really interesting things as far as the layouts go. Here we have one half of the page is printing with a signature that's got two-color printing, and here's another signature that's printing one color. And by putting them together, he can create some really interesting compositions. So here's one color black ink printing on a piece of white paper, and here's 4 color, and by putting those pieces of paper together into that signature, that he can create black and white crossing over into a really interesting configuration. Same thing up there. So that's really kind of the thing that I'm talking about. Here's that idea of the crossover. So here's the gutter where it would cross over, and the side is printing all black on this kind of paper, and on this paper it's printing in several colors. Or over here, so we have another where he's printing black on one signature, and he's printing 4 colors on another. So he could do some really interesting things printing-wise when he was putting these together. The other thing that he learned and that he brought to artists was the idea of public domain on images. And this is something that people didn't really realize, but that there are a lot of images that are available for people to use as part of the public domain. That means that the artist has been dead for is long dead, and that it's been at least 50, I think it's 50 years since he died, so his family no longer has claims to that artwork, and so then it becomes part of the public domain, which means that you don't have to pay for the rights for that image. A lot of museums too, and this is where he went for a lot of artwork. He went to museums, and he said because there were public domain images, could he use those images? A lot of museums pushed back and said, well, but we own the right to that image because it's part of our collection. But they also knew that it still belonged to the public domain. So they would say, yeah, you can use that image. The only caveat is you can't crop the image. So he would go ahead and he would use these public domain images that were found in museums, and he would just use them in their full form. And that made it really interesting, and again, made it really interesting composition. That still holds true today. You can still do that today. So this is another little interesting discovery that Bradbury Thompson did in doing these pieces for Westvaco. He did hundreds of the Westvaco catalogs, Westvaco Inspirations catalogs, as a print representative, over 20 years worth of working on these. They inspired a lot of people in the way that they were produced. He would put them out on a monthly basis. And so he's no longer out there selling printing anymore. Now he was out there promoting printing and these pieces that he would do. And when he came across situations where he had nothing else that he could use, he would make up art on his own. But he usually was able to find stuff in the back rooms where he didn't have to spend any money to create this artwork. And again, he did some really interesting things for Westvaco. He went on to greater possibilities, and even when he was at Westvaco, he was still doing some interesting stuff. Like, for example, he realized somewhere along the line that his youngest son, was dyslexic, and which meant that he was having difficulty reading. And it wasn't because he couldn't conceive what the letters were, but he was having a hard time understanding why we have a different version of the letter R in an uppercase versus a different version of the letter R in a lowercase. And the same thing for the letter A and the letter G and so on, that there were a lot of letters that we have in our alphabets that are different in the uppercase version of them versus the lowercase. And so he decided that he was going to take it upon himself to try to come up with a way to simplify the alphabet so that instead of having essentially 52 characters that somebody had to memorize, they only had to memorize the 26 characters and thus make reading more legible to people. So he created this thing called Alphabet 26, which is actually based upon the Baskerville font as it already existed, but he changed it around a little bit and created this new alphabet that he incorporated and used an awful lot in the Westvaco series. So he applied those in the layouts that he was doing for Westvaco. He was amazingly prolific. He ended up working for various magazines at various points. He did Mademoiselle magazine and Glamour magazine before Sylvia Pinellas took over those roles. In the year 1945 alone, he designed the final 3 issues of a wartime magazine called Victory and USA. So those were a couple of those magazines that he was doing. He also became the art director for Mademoiselle magazine, where he worked for nearly 15 years. He also accepted the role as an art director for Art News and Art News annual, which he held as a position for 27 years. He designed a new brochure, system for Ford Motor Company, and he also designed that mono alphabet that I just showed you about. And then he was also still working in Westvaco, as I said. So he was doing lots and lots of stuff for all of these companies, and that was just in 1 year that he was doing all of that. So he went on to some really prolific stuff. Probably the prettiest, the most interesting project that he did was one that he did for Washburn College in Kansas. And this was, he actually developed a Bible for them. So they decided that they were a religious school, and they asked him to design a Bible for them. But instead of designing a Bible that is pretty, the standard traditional Bible, he decided to make his Bible artistic. And so he did that same thing that he did with Westvaco. He contacted museums, he found out what art was available, and he incorporated public domain images into the Bible that he did. Now, a lot of those images were very horizontal images. So we have a picture of a Last Supper of some sort. We've got Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden for this image at the top, or it could be something else, but that's how I'm interpreting it. In any case, they were horizontal images. And he knew that if he turned them as horizontal images, they would be very small on this page. So instead, he just turned them sideways and made people have to look at them. He wasn't violating any rules. Nobody said that you had to have those images showing in their upright state. They just said that you couldn't crop them. So he had them included, and what he ended up with was something that was very elegant to look at and very fresh in the way that he created the designs for them. So again, Bradbury Thompson, very innovative as far as design goes. The last of the American designers I want to show for this part of American modernism was an innovator by the name of Saul Bass. And Saul Bass was the same era as, actually, pretty much the same education as what Paul Rand had. He came from New York, came from Brooklyn, New York, just like Paul Rand did. He went to Art Students League, just like Paul Rand did. He went to school at Parsons School of Design, just like Paul Rand did. And for a short time, Saul Bass had actually stayed in New York and worked in advertising in New York. However, after a while, he realized that he wanted to be someplace else, and he had been hearing good things about California, and so he decided to move to California just as the movie industry was really picking up in California. So he moved out to Los Angeles, and he got himself in the ground floor of the movie industry there. I want to show you a couple of things that Saul Bass did. So I'm going to have to close up of this and open up. Where are you? There it is. And open up. Where'd you go? There it is. This. So I want to show you a couple of things that Saul Bass did. And I'm going to show you the first, the title sequence that goes along with that movie that I just showed you, or that poster that I just showed you. This is for a movie called Man with the Golden Arm, and this title sequence changed the way that movie title sequences work from that point forward. I'm going to show this to you, and then we'll go back to the slides. So let's look at this, and let's see if we got sound. Forgive the poor quality on this; it's really crappy. that movie was about?
No,
Man with a golden arm. What does that mean? What does a man with a golden arm mean? What does that mean?
Sports, this guy a baseball pitcher or something, or like a bond.
Okay, it has something to do with his arm, right? Yeah. Okay. Looking at this poster too. What do you think? Okay, well, let's not even like try to figure out what the title means. Let's just like look at the graphic that's here. Look at the title sequence that we saw there. Was it a happy movie? No, it doesn't feel that, does it? Not a happy little romance or love story or anything like that going on. So some kind of strife going on in that movie, right? What tells us that?
Dark colors.
Dark colors, good, yeah. Anything else that tells us that?
Hard angles.
What do you think?
The music.
The music. What about the music?
It was kind of like low.
A lot of brass.
Yeah, a lot of brass or what they call blue notes.
Yeah, kind of like leading up to something.
Right. So it was kind of building. It was crescendoing. And if you listen to it again, you notice that it starts out as just kind of like a happy little beat, and you can kind of tap your foot to it, and it sounds kind of good. And then it starts to get into these flat notes and flats and sharps in the notes, and so they stop being whole notes and they start to become a little edgy and what are called in jazz world as blue notes. And then just even like looking here, and you started to say something.
Yeah, hard angles.
The hard angles on this, and so, and not even just like squared off hard angles, kind of like jagged angles that are shown on it, like somebody took out a pair of scissors and was cutting this out, so nobody's even doing this with any kind of precision. It's just kind of ragged looking. The typography here looks very raggedy. It doesn't look like hand script. It doesn't look playful and charming. It looks kind of scary almost in the way that it's conceived, the way that it's drawn out here. So. Going back to 1950s and the vernacular of that time, a man with a golden arm would be somebody with a heroin addiction. So this story is about a jazz musician who has an issue, he has a problem, and that's what the story is about. Now, what makes this innovative and special and different is the way that Saul Bass and Otto Preminger decided to go after this movie. This movie, as a movie poster, the people that are shown as the title characters or the main characters in this movie, Frank Sinatra, Eleanor Parker, Kim Novak, all of them were celebrities in this time. They were all very well-known people in the movie industry, celebrities, big stars, and yet their pictures aren't on this poster. That was one thing that really set this movie poster apart, because they chose not to do that. Instead, they decided to make this graphic, which also has an appearance in the title sequence. They decided to make that the most important part of this movie poster. And that was a really big, dramatic thing to do. They also made it so that title sequence that they were showing, that people had to see the title sequence to the movie. And the way that they did that was something different from the way that most title sequences were done at that point. If you go prior to 1955 and look at movies that were produced before 1955, you're going to find that most of the movies have horrible movie graphics, title sequences, if they have them at all. There are a lot of movies that didn't even have them. They would have like a black screen that started at the front, and maybe they did a little splash of some kind of graphic that looked like, twisted fabric with type kind of sitting on top of it, and then they would have another slide that would show who was in the movie, and then they would immediately move into the movie. There was very little in the way of title sequences, and you can think of a lot of movies that happened before this time, like Gone with the Wind. Go back and look at the title sequence of Gone with the Wind. It's horrible. And it's ridiculous, because they literally have the title going in with the words "gone with the wind," and they have winds, like these swirly lines, like the wind is blowing in those words, which has absolutely nothing to do with the movie at all. There's no wind in Gone with the Wind, I'm sorry. The title has nothing to do with what was happening. And the sequence that they created for the title sequence of that movie had nothing to do with it. In this particular movie, by doing it this way, they chose to make this as a part of the storytelling in the movie. And that had never really happened before. So by doing this, by creating this title sequence, they decided that the title sequence was kind of a prelude, an intro to what the movie was going to be about. And again, this changed the way that movie title sequences are worked in today. To do this, to make sure that people were paying attention, they had a note on the can of the film when it came into the theater. And it said on the front of the cans, projectionists close the doors and draw the curtains before you start the sequence up. Because they didn't. Typically, before this period of time, whenever there was a movie, they would have the lights on full throughout the entire house of the movie house. And they would start the movie up because there was nothing special to see. And when people would hear the sounds of the music starting for the movie, that's when they would go from the lobby into the theater. So they would take like 2 minutes for people to get settled into their seats, and they'd miss the whole dialogue that was happening in the beginning of the movie. And they were paying no attention to what was going on on the movie, to the point that they didn't even bother to open up the curtains when the title sequences were going. In this particular case, they said draw the curtains and turn the lights down so that people would come into the theater. They pushed people from the lobby into the theater before they started this movie. And then once they did, then they were treated to that title sequence that we see right there. So this is groundbreaking for title sequences, and it changed the way the title sequences happened from this point forward, because nobody had ever seen and experienced this before. As far as Saul Bass is concerned, his start with the movie industry really came when he started to work with Otto Preminger, who is the guy that created that movie, Man with the Golden Arm. He originally came in to design the posters for Carmen Jones's movie, and then once he was there, then he talked his way into letting him design the title sequences. But it wasn't until after he'd done Man with the Golden Arm that really people started to pay attention. From that point forward, Saul Bass became very famous for doing not only his title sequences, but his movie posters. And again, he utilized the same kind of techniques that he used in Man with the Golden Arm, paring the movie down so that it wasn't the celebrity that was the most important part, it was the graphics and the interpretation of the graphics. Kind of like those Alvin Lustig covers, so that it was no longer this kind of Harlequin romance kind of image that was typical of movie posters at this time, but instead something that was an interpretation, an artistic interpretation. In the case of Saul Bass, he was not forced into using hand letter type. The movie industry was very rich, there was a lot of money available to him, and he had enough time, enough leeway as far as time goes, to be able to design the posters any way that he wanted to. But he purposely chose to use hand lettering in a lot of his posters because he recognized the quality that hand lettering gave to the posters. So it added in an aspect of humor, it added in a sense of irony, and again, that intuitive American know-how that became a part or an emblem of the types of posters that were part of this movie industry. The movie's title sequence, or the movie campaign that he did for the film Exodus, was a really interesting one. This is one of the first times when we see guerrilla marketing techniques being used in advertising as well. So they had, long before the movie came out, had created this kind of graphic. Exodus was a blockbuster bestseller book that came out in the early 1950s. And people were very excited about this movie. It was about the plight of the Jews from Germany to Israel and the formation of Israel itself. And the movie was going to star Joanna Woodward and Paul Newman and a bunch of other people that were in the movie. But again, in the promotion pieces that Saul Bass was doing, he never showed those faces. He didn't use them. Instead, he created this graphic that just kept on creeping up again and again as they led up to the movie. So they would use this graphic anytime they were doing something for the movie, to the point where they started to use this graphic and they were like spray painting it on the sides of buildings. and using it as small handout cards in the theaters before, or even putting it on people's seats so that they had these little emblems that they made them look forward to the movies. It was really interesting. Probably his greatest accomplishments came when he started to work for Alfred Hitchcock and started to design posters and graphics and film title sequences for Alfred Hitchcock. And probably one of his most important films was for the film Psycho. Anybody here seen Psycho? Let me ask this question: how many of you guys have not seen the movie Psycho?
I see clips of it.
Okay, so a lot of you guys haven't seen Psycho, but do you know what it's about?
Yeah.
Is it okay if we say, without giving you feeling like you've been, I mean, the movie's been around since 1960.
Spoiler
so,
alert.
So spoiler alert, it's about a psychopathic killer. Hence the title of the movie, and a pretty crazy character. But not only did Saul Bass design the title sequences for the movie, but he also helped design the sequencing of shots for the very famous shower scene in this movie. And you can see his storyboards here, and we can see parts of that here. I'm going to show you those two things, the title sequence and also the shower sequence, if you guys can hang out with me for just 10 more minutes here. A few minutes. So let's do Psycho. Like that little slicing going out with the stuff, yeah.
This, like, for some reason, like, some of that music sounded like something from a movie called, I think it was like a call that came from inside the house or something like that. There was like, it was, I don't know, I think it was like kind of a horror movie, but there was like music that was like suspense when this lady was like babysitting or whatever. And like, there was like a famous line or whatever where it's like, please, like, it's coming from inside the house, but it was like really cool because that music reminded me, it was like creepy and really.
Scream or something.
Yeah, well, I think that they've actually used portions of it, or tried to incorporate kind of that stuff, because it becomes so much of a stereotype of this horror genre. I'll show you guys the shower sequence on next Monday's class, so we'll start off the class with that, and we'll finish out this part with Saul Bass and go on to our next segment. Guys, have a great weekend. I'll talk to you on Monday. Don't forget to take your test. If you haven't taken your test, take your test. I saw this morning that there were 6 people that still haven't taken their test. Don't forget your observation.